So my name is Emilia, and I've been calling this together and also asking Stephen if he can be with us today. This is a part of a kind of trying out webinars on behalf of Permaculture Sweden, and at this point in a project called PolyCulture, PolyCulture and food resilience. Now I actually forgot the name. Food resilience through biodiversity in local communities. That's the name of the project, and we are 5 partner countries with NGOs in each country. So it's Poland, Estonia, Northwestern Russia, Belarus, and Sweden. And I think we're quite some people here from that partnership, but the main part of us, the participants, are from other contexts. So before giving the word over to Stephen, I just wanted to say something why this is important to us to invite this theme around edible perennial plants and winter harvest. In this project, we work a lot about the integration between biodiversity and food. And as perhaps many of you know, that's a really vast theme, like how biodiversity can benefit food production and how food production actually can benefit biodiversity. And through that, many themes come back over and over again. And one is the benefits of using perennial plants in agriculture and in gardening as food. And also to use a diversity of plants in many different ways. And so seeing that how that benefits carbon sequestration, biodiversity both in soil and above soil, health in humans and communities, you know, the list can be done like very long. So it's very relevant for us, this theme that we gather around today. And we hope to take this further to tap into the technology that we can have at hand today in meeting, you know, across networks and across sectors perhaps, around what matters to us. And like building knowledge and networks together around like sustainable living. So that's a bit of the purpose for this meeting. Just wanted to say some more about like how this can work. So I will be looking at the chat quite a lot. So if you have like a certain question that you would like to ask Stephen, you can write that question in. Yeah, so now I got the question. Sorry, it is normal that I do not have any sound yet. Is it that you don't hear me? Maybe you can just give an answer in the chat. So anyway, the others of you hear me. Just not, yeah. If you want to ask a clarifying question, like you feel that there's something unclear, then we start to do in this way that we just unmute ourselves, which you can do on your screen, and ask Stephen to clarify. But the more like separate question, the individual questions, put those in the chat, and I invite you to ask. So we try that out. Okay. So this is, as I said, a bit of a learning journey for us to host these kinds of webinars. So let's see how it goes. And we are a bit less people than were registered, so I think that will make it more easy for us actually. Yeah, one thing more is that in the upper right corner, you have a button where it says speaker view or gallery view. If you click on that, the gallery view, you will see everyone at the same time now. And in the speaker view, you will see the person that speaks in bigger. So this can be good to know. then Stephen will start to share screen, and then it will be a bit different. So also before we start, I just want to hear, like, I know that we are Norway, Sweden, Russia, perhaps Estonia here, but which other countries are present? So if you are from another country, just unmute yourself and say where you are from.
Sweden.
Yeah. Thank you.
Denmark.
Denmark.
United States.
United States. Okay. So, Stephen, warmly welcome, and the word is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so I start, yeah? Oops.
Yes, and I also saw that there's people here from France, Czech Republic, and the UK, British Columbia. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to my living room. This is the largest crowd I've ever had in my living room. Well,
Stephen?
it will be. I think we're, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, before you start, I just want to say another technical thing. Now, if you see many videos on the right side, you can click on the top bar and try out different ways to see. So you could click there so that you only see Stephen. Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Can you see my slide, everybody?
I think so. Someone that cannot see?
Okay. Right. Then we'll start. So as I said, welcome everybody to my living room. It's a very cold day here, as it is in most of Europe at the moment. It's about -15 centigrade outside. The wood stove is going at full belt here, so it's getting a bit hot. If I turn my head, I can look out over the fjord. It's beginning to get dark, and we have an almost full moon out there. Today, if I can just, I'm not myself seeing. Yeah, that's sorry. No, a few technical hitches to start with. I've never done this before either, so bear with me. But today's talk has been a little bit changed from what we thought about at the beginning. At the beginning, I thought that we would just talk about basically about my book, Around the World in 80 Plants. But as you can see a 3-hour lecture on YouTube of that, we thought that we would do something a little bit different this time. And I practiced this talk in Southampton in the UK last week for the first time. It's a talk which is evolving, but it revolves around this picture which you can see in front of you, or the two pictures. These two salads were made 1 year ago here in Trondheim, and the one on the right has 105 ingredients, and the one on the left has 140 ingredients. And these salads were made at the beginning of March last year, when we still had snow on the ground, the soil was frozen. None of the ingredients were taken from refrigeration or anything. They were all grown around my house and garden. And many people were kind of a bit surprised that you could have such a poly salad, if you like, such a diverse salad in this part of the world near the Arctic at this time of year. And as you maybe know, maybe I'll just go to this picture here. This is where I'm living in Trondheim, which is at 63.5 degrees north, in a little place called Malvik, about 17 kilometers away from Norway's 3rd largest city, Trondheim. It's a relatively mild climate for how far north we are, but there's a very large variation in the climate from year to year. Some years it can freeze for several months. 2 years ago, we could actually dig the soil all winter, which was a bit worrying. So we're seeing these large swings in the climate, probably more in the Arctic regions than elsewhere. Okay, let's see. I'll go back to this one. I thought I would just say something about the inspirations, or my inspirations over the years. I grew up in England, in southern England, and I moved to Norway in 1981 to get a job. It was very difficult to get jobs at that time in the UK. I'm qualified as an oceanographer, so I work with the sea, basically. I did work with the sea until the end of April last year, when I retired from my full-time job to concentrate on my first love, which is plants. So I moved to Norway in 1981, and I was also a vegetarian. And that was a very big change from England to Norway, because in Norway at that time, there really were only a handful of vegetables available in the supermarkets here. And people also told me that the reason there were so few vegetables was because the climate was so cold, in particular the summers. And probably what I've been doing over the last 36 years since I moved here is to disprove that, because my garden today contains somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 different edible plants, and most of them are perennials. Okay, now one of my big inspirations, maybe you can see my mouse here, was what we call Nytteväxtförening here, which translates as Useful Plants Society. We have a national society in Norway, which is, as far as I know, unique in the world. As far as I know, there is no other country which has a society which is devoted to foraging. In other words, collecting plants from nature. And it's also over 100 years old, so it's a very old establishment. And actually the local group of this Useful Plant Society was established in 1981, the same year as I moved to Trondheim, just as a pure accident. And the first spring in '82, I joined a group foraging for leafy green vegetables in the springtime. And these people, in particular this guy here, Jan Erik Kofod, who's a big inspiration over the years, were in their 20s at that time. They were inspired youngsters who were inspired by the green wave in the 70s, and were willing and interested to learn about wild, useful plants. And Jan Erik, I remember teaching me in the early 80s that there was something like 60 wild edible species just in my local area around my house. Not all of them were tasty ones. Some of them were what I call, I put in the emergency food category. So these are plants which are, you would only really eat if you were really hungry. But in any case, many of them were really, really tasty. And so I joined these foraging tours on the beach, and I started learning. Now, as part of my job as an oceanographer, I traveled around the world to conferences, and we also had a big project in the South Pacific. I was working with ocean wave energy at the time, renewable energy from the ocean waves. And on my travels around the world, I started buying books on foraging from other parts of the world. And I remember one year I was in Seattle. Hello, Seattle. I know there are some people from Oregon here and Washington, so welcome. I bought this book, Sturtevant's Edible Plants of the World, which is a book which was put together by an American professor between the mid-19th century and 1920. and it was put out after his death. And it contains information, pictures about 3,000 of the world's edible plant species. And I noticed looking through this book, there were many plants which I already had in my garden because I inherited an ornamental garden. Many of the plants were actually ornamentals that we use here in Norway and in other parts of the world. Another big inspiration was Plants for Future and Ken Fern in the UK, who put together this great online database, which is freely available for anyone today, which contains information of about 7,000 plants. I remember Ken kindly sending me the whole database in about 1992-93 on a set of these old diskettes, if you're old enough to remember diskettes. Okay, but my most important book over the years is this book, Cornucopia 2. I have it here as well. You can see my picture. As you can see, I've worn out one of these, and in fact, the one that looks new in this picture is also looks like the worn out one today. And this is a book again put together by a professor in Faciola in California, Cornucopia 2, a source book of edible plants, which contains information of about 3,000 species and about 7,000 varieties of cultivars. And it's just packed full of information. I don't know if you can see that. Just masses of information about the world's edible plants. And that was a huge inspiration, having that database available. Okay, this is where I live. It's a house on the hill with a fairly big garden around. There's about half an acre of land, or about 2,300 square meters around the house. And I cultivate about 2/3 of that. So that gives you a kind of an idea of how it's not huge. And I don't have many of each of the plants that I grow. But as you can see, it's actually, there's quite a lot of trees and bushes and many perennials growing under those trees and bushes. There's very little open area. So it's not actually the ideal place for a traditional vegetable garden. And notice also the house itself actually has, whoops, sorry, it keeps on moving. The house itself actually has 3 stories with windows in all these stories. Plus it has a full length cellar or basement under the house, which you can stand up in. So there are 4 rooms in the cellar. So it's a very big cold cellar under the house, which is one of the clues to how I managed to grow so many plants in the middle of the winter. Okay. The view is fabulous over the Trondheimsfjord, which is Norway's 3rd longest fjord. Of course, it doesn't look like that today. And this is just a picture of part of my garden, just showing the PolyCulture, and below is an area which is kind of developed into what we call a forest garden. This is the view today, this morning. Much different to that summer picture. We have a good snow cover, thanks to, we had quite a bit of snow at the weekend, so the plants in my garden are covered in a blanket of snow at the moment. And down the slope on the steepest part of my garden, it's developed what most people recognize as a forest garden today. In fact, the whole garden is really a forest garden because it's there are both edible trees and bushes and herbaceous perennials. There are root crops. There are a bit of everything in the garden. And this plant here, this is my largest vegetable. It's a herbaceous perennial. I'll come back to it a bit later. This picture was taken in the middle of June, so it is only 3 months away at the moment. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept of a forest garden, it's basically where you design an edible a piece of land. Could be a garden, it could be a slightly larger area, based around basically replicating the way nature works. That we have, first of all, edible trees. There could be walnuts, apples, things like that up in the canopy. Perhaps on the sunny side of a forest garden, you could grow conventional root crops. Got berry bushes down here, and under the trees there are a multitude of leafy perennials which can be grown, and some of these leafy perennials can also climb up into the trees. Now, my book, Around the World in 80 Plants, is primarily about these leafy green vegetables, 6 and 7 here. And also many of the plants I will talk about today are in that category. Now, when I basically dissected that salad that I showed you at the beginning, if I thought about the ingredients that were in that salad, I found that there were many different categories of winter and spring salad ingredients. Now, I don't know, Emilia, I don't see the chat, so you'll have to tell me. I don't know, I'm not sure exactly how to.
I do have a question, actually,
Yeah, sure.
from Merli from Estonia. She wondered, when you were standing in this big plant,
Yeah.
there was a small plant on the side with green berries. What was it?
Yeah. That was red currant. It's actually one of the plants I inherited. So that plant has always been in my garden. It's probably about 60 years old. It's a red currant bush and produces masses of currants every year. Okay. And
I would like to suggest, because we're only the half of the size of the group that were registered, which mean that we could try it out. That all of you that we that participate, that we can ask questions directly. But maybe, Stephen, do you think it's best to ask them when? Just tell us, when is it best to ask questions?
Yeah, well, we can there are natural pauses between the different categories that I will go through now, and so I think you'll see when there's a title that comes up or something. When we haven't started talking about the plants yet, soon we will do that. And when we talk about the plants, as I say, I've divided the talk up into these different sections, which you can see here, the different categories of winter and spring salad ingredients. So they could be perennial vegetables forced in the living rooms. I'll explain that later. Harvested in the cellar. Tree leaves forced inside. I'll explain that later. Seed sprouts, many of you are familiar with, but perhaps not seed sprouts of perennial plants. Outside garden harvest. There are very few that I can harvest outside, but there are a couple. It depends really on your climate. I was in southern England last week, and there the foraging season was already far ahead, and there are many vegetables you can harvest at this time of year. You can use forcing pots outside, foraging, of course. In the salad is also dried and fresh fruit. Of course, fruit and berries are perennials themselves. There are tubers, both stored in the cellar and also stored in warmer places, depending on the species. You can grow houseplants, which are edible. And when you use garden soil with your houseplants, you actually get weeds coming up, and some of the weeds are edible. There are seeds and nuts, which you can harvest and store in the winter. I have a section on edible flowers, both edible flowers which are forced and also edible flowers from houseplants. And finally, I'll just point out that where I'm living, I cannot grow even plants like kale outside. It's too cold. So if I try to grow kale outside in the winter, it will be dead by the springtime. So anything that's green in the winter like that will die. So what I do is I move all my annual vegetables, and I do grow some annual vegetables, into my cellar. And in the case of kale, I plant the kale plants into soil, in boxes in the soil. And when you do that and it's cold enough, they just go into a, they become dormant and stay like that all winter. So I can just go down to the cellar and harvest what I would normally, what most people would harvest outside. Okay. So can I just, first of all, just say something about why I think we should be growing more perennials, plants which I call perma-veggies, permanent vegetables, permaculture vegetables, whatever you like. I call them perma-veggies. And there are various reasons. The first one here is that perennials are basically easier to grow organically, because most perennials are growing most actively in the springtime, when there are much fewer insects causing damage and other diseases like fungal diseases, etc. in the springtime. So in my climate, actually, all the perennials I harvest in the springtime are perfect. There's no damage from any organisms. The perennials are also, they need less water, because they're growing most actively in the springtime, when there is enough water in the soil after the winter, particularly in areas where you get a lot of snow in the winter. You have the snow melt, and then the soil is damp until midsummer, when most perennials stop growing actively. So this means that perennials are much more advantageous in drier conditions, and more robust in that way to climate change. And the reason, and part of the reason here is that the root system of perennials goes much deeper and is able to suck up any water that is available, even quite deep down. This also applies in the summer, of course. Now, there's less need for fertilizer. Actually, none of my perennials gets any fertilizer at all. And every year they come back. And I should say that my soil is pretty fertile. I don't have more than about 15, maximum 20 centimeters of soil anywhere in my garden. So it's a very shallow soil over rock. And the rock itself is it's a kind of a shale. It breaks up quite easily. So I have a very mineral rich soil. So I found that there's much less need for fertilizer, as the roots are more efficient throughout the season, as they go much deeper into the soil and sometimes right down into the rock. Perennials we use much less energy on perennials. It's like the ultimate no-dig gardening. Okay, we plant perennials and they come back year after year. We don't have to dig. So we don't have to dig every spring or plow every spring when we're using perennials. Now they do also traditionally, even if we continue in the same way as we have today, they do complement traditional vegetables. They're mainly spring harvest, which is a subject in itself, which you can read more about in the book, how we cope with the fact that perennials are mostly harvested in the springtime. So traditionally foraged plants would decrease the need to import food during the Hungry Gap. The Hungry Gap, I guess you're familiar with the, vårknipe in Scandinavia. It's the period after the vegetables that we're storing in our cellars or otherwise are finished, and before the first crops become available in the summertime. And in fact, if you're growing mainly perennials, which you could, and I'm kind of tempted to go over to purely perennials in my garden. the hungry gap turns into what we could call the full gap. So it's, you know, you're full up, you know, instead of being hungry, the opposite. Because to me, the springtime is the time when we have nature really is full of food. So if you're a forager, I know some people that try and live only by foraging. And for them, it's the springtime, which is the time when they have most food. So it's kind of the opposite to the traditional way of thinking that it's the autumn, which is the time of plenty. I should also mention, as you mentioned, Amelia, in the beginning, perennials also lock up or sequester more carbon in the soil. I should also mention that, that also we're becoming more and more aware of the role of fungi in the soil, also with perennial, herbaceous perennials, etc. They're playing an important role in increasing our yields. Many species of perennials grow best, as I've mentioned earlier, in shady conditions, are therefore suitable for forest gardens. So many of my vegetables are growing in places I wouldn't dream of planting conventional annual crops, which are typically grown on big fields, as sunny as possible. Okay. Another benefit for me is that many of these perennial vegetables double as ornamentals. So we can actually harvest the young shoots in the springtime, and then they often will just come back again, they will sprout again, and they will still flower in the same season. And there are many examples of this, so that you can forget just growing ornamentals, you can just grow food plants, or edible plants. Because many of our most common ornamental plants are also very good food plants. We'll show some examples of that later. And from a perspective of living quite near the Arctic in Norway, I don't have to travel far to get to the mountains. I believe that we could be growing much more food in short season areas, mountain areas, cold areas, Arctic, and maybe we'll have to in the future as climate change hits more fully in warmer places further south. The areas of food production will naturally move northwards. But even today, we could be growing many more, much more, particularly leafy green vegetables in cold areas. And that's because perennials, they get going very early in the springtime. The roots are already in place. They don't have to wait for the seed to sprout and the plant to start growing to start growing properly. So perennials kind of optimize the available solar energy throughout the season. Okay, so most perennials, even in mountain areas, we have examples of very big plants actually growing in the mountains. I'll show some examples of that later. Okay, maybe if anybody has any questions at this stage, I'm just trying to find my...
There is a question about how do you fertilize your garden?
How do I fertilize my garden? Just a second, I've kind of lost things here. How do I fertilize my garden? Well, perennials, as I mentioned, I'm lucky that I've got fertile soil where I'm living, and I find that I actually don't need to fertilize my perennials. They just get what nature brings and what the rocks below are breaking up and releasing minerals into the soil. But of course, that wouldn't apply to everybody. However, as I mentioned, I still do grow annuals, and for that I make compost every year using kitchen waste, vegetative material from the garden, and I also use seaweed, which is easily available on the shoreline. I've been using seaweed for 35 years almost. So I go down to the beach and collect several loads of seaweed, and I let it lay in a pile for a couple of months before I make a compost heap. And the compost I use is a cold compost, so it just decays slowly, and I use the compost just once a year in the springtime for the annual crops. Okay. Any other questions at this stage? Then we'll, is that okay, Amelia?
Yeah.
Hello?
If there's not anyone right now
We
that
have
have a question. Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
What technical works should be done in your garden? So what do you do there actually?
What do I do? Yeah, well, it is there is obviously there is some work, and perennials also don't always. I mean, I'm in my garden. I've got enough space. I produce all my own food for at least leafy greens and root crops and things like that. I never go to the supermarket. I also have all the fruit I need. I never buy fruit. But I do buy grains and things like that. And I also, well, basically I don't have time or the need to store my perennial vegetables in the springtime. Traditionally, the way to store perennial vegetables would be by solar drying, because after the harvest season, it's also the warmest time of the year when you've got most sun available, or fermentation, which was the traditional way used everywhere around the world, basically. And so I'm not really harvesting my crops as hard as I could be, and I don't really know how hard I could be cropping the perennials. I don't have an answer to that question, really. But yeah, what do I do? I mean, I'm continually growing or testing out new things. So during the winter, I'm sowing seed. I start sowing seed in November, and with perennials, most of them need to be cold treated, so-called stratification, to germinate. In other words, they need to go through a process of cold and warm throughout the whole winter as the snow comes and it melts. And so those seed are basically put out in the garden under in a kind of a cold frame, so that they're totally exposed to the winter. And then they all start germinating in the springtime. So spring, as I say, I'm still growing things like leeks, Swiss chard, some, not many brassicas. I grow a lot of chicories and things like that. So I start off many of those indoors starting in February, and so that they're big enough to plant out in the springtime to extend the season. And with the perennial vegetables, bushes and trees, there's a lot of pruning that needs to be done. I've never really replaced a perennial vegetable, but if you want maximum yield, you maybe need to replace them every 10 to 20 years or so. So maybe move them to somewhere else. It depends very much on where you are, what your soil conditions and climate conditions are like. Okay. Okay, shall we move on?
Yes.
Okay, the first section are perennial vegetables which I harvest in the cellar. Well, what I do is in the autumn, I actually dig up the roots of quite a few of my perennials, and I basically pot them up in earth in buckets. Or I could also do it in, you can also make a kind of a wooden frame filled with earth in the cellar, which, and then just plant these perennials down there. Now, some of those perennials actually will start will start to sprout in the cellar. The cellar temperature is typically in the winter at the moment is about 3 degrees centigrade, minus 15 centigrade outside. It never freezes down there, but typically it would be between 3 and 5 degrees centigrade in midwinter. Now, some perennial vegetables will actually start to sprout in very low temperatures. Don't forget that perennials are actually woodland plants, and they're keyed in to start growing in the very early spring before the leaves appear, while there's still sunlight in deciduous woodland. So I find that, for example, here I have cellar blanched horseradish shoots. Now, horseradish is mostly known as a crop we use the roots of, but particularly in Central Europe, there is also a tradition to use the young shoots of horseradish. And they really are delicious, particularly when they're blanched like this. The blanching is because it's totally dark. I don't use lights. You don't need to use lights in the cellar. So when the new shoots come, they are almost white in this, and that makes for a kind of a sweeter taste than if you had if you'd had lights down there. Okay, so that's one. I can say something else. Yeah, this is just a slide about horseradish. You recognize this one. You make horseradish sauce from the roots. You can also blanch them outside. Here I've just had a pot over the plant in the early spring. And having a pot over the plant, it's warmer under the pot, and then it grows much more quickly. So that's another way of extending the season. It's a beautiful plant, horseradish. It's one of these plants I call edimentals, this combination of edible and ornamental. They look beautiful. And the flowers are also wonderfully tasty in mixed salads. But it seems that further south in Europe, horseradish actually doesn't flower. So it actually flowers more readily in my climate. Now there are a number of root crops. This is a tuberous thistle, Cirsium tuberosum, which I grow as a perennial in my garden. I just harvest some of these roots, these lateral roots, and they'll be stored in the cellar. They need to be kept cool, so I can just harvest them directly in the cellar. We could talk for an hour about dandelions. I've not got time to do that here. You can read much more in my book about this. There are about 12 pages about dandelions. One of the most wonderful and useful plants on the planet. You know, you can make a whole dinner with dandelions. You can use the roots as a root vegetable. You can use the young shoots as a salad crop. You can use the flower stems to make what we call dandy noodles or dandelion noodles. You can use the flower petals in salads. You can use the flower buds. You can pickle them. You can make dandelion coffee. You can make dandelion tea. You can make dandelion wine. And quite soon, you'll also be able to cycle home on tires made of dandelion rubber, because the big American car tire manufacturer Continental announced last year that they were currently testing the world's first car tire made of dandelion rubber, which is the white stuff that comes out of the root. Anyway, there's a lot to talk about dandelion, and there are so many different forms of dandelion as well, not just the common one. This is a red leaf dandelion. There's a pink flowered dandelion, which is often grown as an ornamental in northern Norway. And there are various white flowered varieties. This is dandy chokes. This is one of the real springtime highlights of spring. One of the real gourmet parts of the dandelion. You basically, when you see the flower of the dandelion appearing in the early spring, it appears at ground level. If you dig below the flower, you'll find that the first few centimeters is, there's about a couple of centimeters down to the root. So this white part has been under the soil surface, and hence it's blanched and milder tasting. I call them dandy chokes because this is similar to the concept of artichoke, which is the lower part of the flower of the artichoke. In many parts of the world, they sell dandelions on markets. This is blanched dandelion in a market in southern Germany. These are my own blanched cellar dandelions, which have grown in the cold of my cellar, harvested in March last year. So these were included in the salad. And when they're blanched, they are milder tasting. We can talk a bit about kales, and particularly perennial kales, because I mentioned that I cannot overwinter kales outside. So what I do is I move the plants inside in the autumn, put them in big buckets, and just leave them in the cellar all winter, and then replant in the springtime. But during the winter, the perennial kales will actually start to sprout when the temperature gets above about 5 centigrade in March. But just something about perennial kales first, if you're not aware of it. There's much more in my book. I don't think most people are aware that all the kales and cabbages and broccoli, etc., are all descended from wild ancestors which were perennial. And we only have to go back 100 years or so to find that people in Europe and North America were actually cultivating perennial kales commercially. And they almost disappeared. We've selected more and more for the typical autumn harvest kales and cabbages, etc. And through doing that selection, we've in some way created a problem for ourselves, because I don't know about you, but I have problems growing kales and cabbages, etc., organically, because in the autumn, when they're growing most actively, there are many different pests, such as diamondback moth is a big problem in Norway. It's only in recent years it's started to invade us. It's a big problem in North America as well, I know. And yeah, so and there are a number of fungal diseases as well. But there are these perennials which are actively growing in the springtime, and although they can be, they do resprout in the autumn. They're most actively growing, and we can harvest them in the springtime when there is little. There aren't many butterfly and moth larvae around. And this is just a selection of old varieties which have been rescued from disappearing in the last 10 to 15 years. The bottom here is Daubenton's perennial kale from France. This is tricolores, which was discovered in California. It's a very tall kale. This is a Belgian variety, and at the bottom is the only surviving perennial kale from the UK. We know there were many more in the past. And I went to this garden in 2011 and returned just 2 years ago, and those plants there, or one of them, had grown to this monster. So they can really get big. And this plant here would have got even taller if there were pigeons or doves that were nipping off the tops of this plant the whole time. And most of these perennial kales, they are propagated by cuttings, not by seed, although sometimes they will set seed. And when they do set seed, it's interesting to maybe conceive developing new varieties. And there are a number of amateurs, particularly those who who are part of a Facebook group called Plant Breeding for Permaculture, who are actively collaborating across the continents to develop new interesting perennial kales by crossing some of these older varieties with some of the more modern varieties. This is an example of one of these, which I had in my salad a year ago, which came from a good friend of mine, Chris Homonix in Oregon, who's been doing a lot of great work in crossing perennial kales. And this is a selection of his work, which has just recently become available in Oregon through, I think it's One World. It's a seed and plant company in Oregon. Fantastic range of different perennial kales. So these are becoming more and more popular. Another kale I mention because this is sea kale, which is also spring harvested. This is a kale that I can harvest in my garden. It's not a brassica, it's in Latin Crambi maritima, so it's a different genus, but closely related. And this one will overwinter in my garden if I cover it with leaves in the autumn, and which insulates the plant, which actually dies right down. So it's herbaceous, it goes to sleep, and only the roots survive the winter, which is the clue. The problem with these perennial kales that I've just been talking about is that they stay green all winter. Sea kale, I've just been in the UK, and really sea kale should be the national vegetable of the UK, because in the 19th century, this was a vegetable that was commonly grown, particularly in southern England. But today there isn't hardly any even commercial production of sea kale, and I really don't understand why. There's a demand for it in the leading restaurants in London, but there is hardly anybody growing them. The reason I actually forced some of this for my salad a year ago was that I'd read that in the 19th century, people used to bring these into their greenhouses, and particularly rich people who had these so-called hot houses, which were kept warm in the winter. The sea kale was forced as a Christmas special. So this was a special forced vegetable for Christmas time. It's also a fantastic edimental, it has beautiful flowers. This is from a beach in southern England, but also in a garden it will flower quite prolifically if you don't harvest everything. The broccolis are also tasty, and for many this is really the king of vegetables. It really is one of the tastiest vegetables out there. And in the old days they used these special forcing pots made of clay, particularly the rich people. And again, these pots was to blanch the plant, which is basically the young shoots in the springtime are a little bit too strong for many people, so they blanch them to give a milder tasting product. Yeah, beautiful plant. We'll pass over that. This is the only, as far as I know, production of sea kale shoots in the UK at present for restaurants in London. It's tiny. And this is the product ready to go. Another plant I have in my cellar, which actually grows in my cellar, is a plant which is related in the same genus as celery. It's Apium modiflorum, or fool's watercress. It's a plant which grows in water, a bit like watercress. And I grow it in a bucket like this, and in water. There's no bottom to the bucket, so they're growing in water all year round. And I move this bucket into the cellar in the autumn, and then it starts sprouting in the middle of the winter, and I can harvest the young shoots for salads in the middle of the winter. Okay, that's just a few examples, but there really are hundreds of different perennial roots that you could force in a cellar, if you're lucky enough to have a cellar. But you can also force them inside living rooms, which are heated in some way. Now, in my house, I have the living rooms, which is heated by the wood-burning stove. Most of the other rooms are not heated directly. So they have a temperature of around about 10 degrees centigrade within the house. But the temperature will rise a bit towards the springtime. I should just ask if there are any questions on that last section before we continue.
Yeah, and please ask your question directly. You can just unmute your microphone.
There was a question about your climate conditions during the year. Could you please tell a little bit more?
Okay. We have cool summers, so cold summers compared to, I think probably the average temperature in my climate is 14 to 15 centigrade, okay? So, and it varies a lot from year to year. So some of the best year we had since I moved here, we had 60 days over 20 centigrade. 20 centigrade, 68 Fahrenheit. The worst year we had 2 days above 20 centigrade. Do you understand? So it's a pretty cold, mild summer, and that's partly due to the fact that I'm right next to the fjord. The fjord is cool. It never really warms up properly, or there's a delay. It stays. But in winter, the fjord is at about, it doesn't go below +6 centigrade, so it never freezes. So the fjord represents warmth in the winter and cold in the summer. So our winters are relatively mild. It's unusual that the temperature here will go below -20 centigrade. Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, in some years, in recent years, it has hardly gone below -10 centigrade, and it hasn't frozen properly. But more importantly, because I'm so far north, we lose the dark sky. We don't see the stars from April to maybe the end of August. And in the winter, it's quite dark because we're so far north. So actually the sun sets at the beginning of December and it rises again in the middle of January. Okay, so we have several weeks without any direct sunlight. So yeah, so we have, so it's a climate with relatively mild winters, considering how far north we are, and relatively cool, cold summers. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, if there's not any other questions, we could continue.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'll show just a few examples of perennials that I force. And in some cases, I could just have the plants outside. Obviously, in the middle of the winter, I can't dig up plants in the garden because it's often frozen. But I can dig them up in the autumn and just put them in a pot ready to bring into the house. So I do that for plants which are very hardy and can tolerate that. Not all plants can. If you've got a plant exposed in a pot, the roots will get much colder than if the roots are in the soil. So it depends really on what species we're talking about. So one of the plants which I forced for the salad last year, which is very, very hardy, is this Caucasian spinach, or Hablitzia tamnoides, which is a vegetable which was basically discovered, I think, in Scandinavia. there was a woman called Lena Israelsson, who's a Swedish gardening, vegetable author. I corresponded with her around about 1999, 2000. And she sent me one of her books, and in one of her books she talked about this plant here, Hablitzia tamnoides, which has become known as the Caucasian spinach, because it comes from the Caucasus. It was introduced to Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and also in Estland, I believe, and some of the Baltic states in the 1870s as an ornamental plant. It's a climber. It can climb to 3 to 4 meters. It's closely related to the chenopod's, or the fat hen, if you know that, Chenopodium album, which is a common annual weed. It's also related to good King Henry, which is sometimes used as a perennial vegetable. Now this plant, it turns out, this woman, Lena, she sent me a plant in the early 2000s. And I discovered that it was incredibly hardy. It would actually sprout in the autumn, and the young sprouts would stand a couple of centimeters high throughout the winter. And despite the temperature going down to -20 centigrade, they would be undamaged in the springtime. So I could actually harvest this one outside, just in small amounts, even in the winter. And I wrote about this plant in Permaculture magazine in the UK in the mid-2000s. And basically it's a plant that was totally unknown outside of Scandinavia. So it was Scandinavia's big vegetable secret. And thanks to the social media, we have a Facebook group, Friends of Hablitzia, which you're welcome to come along to. There are probably thousands today who are growing this, and it basically shoots very, very early in the springtime. So usually at the beginning of April in my garden, I can harvest shoots which are up to about 5 to 10 centimeters long. It's very mild tasting, much better tasting than good King Henry, for example, which I call bad King Henry because it tastes horrible. But Hablitzia, it has a very good mild taste, can be used in salads, and it can also be used in as a spinach crop. And yeah, so I forced that last year. As you can see on the left-hand side, it's just appearing. It's often kind of reddish in the spring. This is just a few pictures of what it looks like in gardens. You can also use the older leaves in, for example, in this quiche egg pie in the summer. And it's turned out that actually nutritionally, it's actually better than spinach and New Zealand spinach, kind of conventional crops that we can compare it with. Another plant which I forced for this salad, a perennial, which I brought into my living room to bring it on in time for making these salads. And I should mention that these salads were actually created for a film festival in Trondheim, which called Cosmorama. The main topic of the film festival was films about food, including Michael Pollan's film In Defense of Food, which some of you will have seen. So I was asked if I could make a multi-species salad to coincide with the film showing. So that's what I did. So this is Aurelia cordata, or udo. It's a very common vegetable in Japan. And it's also that plant I showed earlier, this very tall plant, my largest vegetable in my forest garden. So I dug up these roots in the autumn. So this is in October, November time, and planted them in a big bucket, brought it into the living room, and then these new shoots started appearing. So you saw there, this is what the plant looks fully developed. And there's a bit of a story behind this this picture here, because this picture was taken, and this is the red currant somebody was mentioning. In front is ostrich fern, which we'll also talk about, one of the world's best edible ferns. because this picture was taken in the middle of June. In the same year, 3 years ago, we had the coldest spring ever in Scandinavia. All right the way up until the middle of June, we didn't have a single day over 20 degrees centigrade. It was very, very cold. But at the same time, it didn't freeze. It was just very, very cold. And conventional farmers had big problems, even up until the middle of June, to get out onto their land and plant and sow seed. And they were talking about a disastrous year. At the same time, in my garden, I had the best yields of food ever, okay, at the same time. And this is kind of surprising to many people, that the coolest spring ever would actually give the best yields. But with perennials, that's what happens, because perennials, as I mentioned earlier, are mostly woodland plants, which are tuned in to growing growing leaves when the temperature is still low in the springtime. So we had ideal conditions for production of leaves right the way through into the middle of June. At the same time, it was too cold for flowers to start appearing. When flowers start appearing, the plant concentrates its energy into producing seed rather than producing leaves. So it's not really that surprising that we have the opposite to conventional farming. And it also goes to show that perennials are much more robust against climate change. So if you get big swings in the climate, the perennials will just stop. So if it gets cold for a period, the perennials will stop growing and just wait for the weather to get better. I've never experienced any year when there has been a crop failure, which you get regularly in conventional agriculture because of bad conditions, particularly during the harvest in the autumn. But of course, this is leafy greens. The young shoots is the product which is used, and they're often blanched in this way. I used a very big bucket over this one, but you could also, I'll show you some ways. This is a Japanese plant. I'll show you some ways in a minute how the Japanese do this. And you can use it as a salad in the springtime. You just basically peel the outside of these shoots, which could be up to 1 meter long, and dice them like this, and then add a salad dressing. Here it was sesame oil, roasted sesame seeds, and soy sauce. This was a Japanese recipe. Also, the broccolis, when the flowers start appearing, are also delicious. And spring 2016, I was on a study tour to Japan to learn more about their production of perennial vegetables. Basically plants that were originally foraged. People have moved into the cities and they miss the good tastes of the countryside. So there's a market around the cities to grow these often perennial plants for the markets. And I read about the fact that this plant, udo, my largest vegetable, was actually forced to produce this white udo in underground caverns in certain very old farms in Western Tokyo. So thanks to various Japanese friends on Facebook who spoke English, I managed to negotiate a visit to one of these farms in Western Tokyo. And here are some pictures from this tour. And to my surprise, basically there were holes in the ground. This is the farmer up here next to one of these holes. It was actually in a woodland. So it's kind of like an extra layer in a forest garden. So the below the surface production layer. So the roots of this big herbaceous perennial are basically moved down into these underground caves, if you like. And because it's totally dark, they just, and the temperature at the time I was there was a constant 18 degrees centigrade. So it was a good temperature, and they just grew in the dark. And because it was dark, there was no chlorophyll production, and you get this white udo, which is the highest class of udo in Japan. This is the farmer here, and various other people who were along helping and on the tour. And this is the farmer, how the farmer packs for the market. And yeah, this is me and the farmer. And it's not the only way that they blanch Udo. This is actually another way of doing it. This is basically an above ground shed where they move the roots again and force them in the, but in these overground sheds, the temperature fluctuates much more, and that apparently gives, the taste isn't as good as the constant underground Udo. So this is second class Udo. And I was lucky, I also was able to witness the third method, which is the traditional method, apart from foraging, of course, because this is a wild edible plant in Japan, which grows in, yeah, kind of open forest conditions. And here you can see that the roots of Udo have been, they've piled soil, and actually it's rice husks, which is a surplus when they're polishing the rice. They polish off the outside of the rice kernels, and they have this waste product, which they use to heap over the plants. This was in a mountain area we visited. Any questions about Udo? It's actually produced in also both in California and the West Coast US, and outside of London. It's actually a plant which is now being cultivated for the Korean and Japanese markets in the big cities.
Yeah, hi, I have a question. How do you sprout that Udo from seed?
It's the seeds, I think, have to be, I'm pretty sure they need to be stratified. So they need cold treatment. At least when I sow the seed in, say, January, they will, and put the sow pot outside, they will actually be, they will actually germinate in the springtime in cool temperature. You could also bring it inside to speed things along, but don't forget, this is a plant that you maybe will have for 30, 40 years. So just saving a few weeks doesn't really make any difference. Okay. Anybody else? No. Okay, so we go on. The next plant is a plant in the carrot family, Oenanthe javanica, Japanese water dropwort, or as they call it in Japan, seri. This is a plant which loves damp conditions. You see it all over Japan, growing in next to ponds and rivers, etc. A bit like watercress in some parts of the world. And this plant is very important in Japan, and we visited a farm. This is a picture from a farm in the lowlands in Japan, where they're producing seri on a year-round basis. It's basically, but be very, very careful, because the genus Oenanthe also includes very poisonous plants. This one is totally safe, but there are other species in the same genus, in the dropwort family, which are deadly poisonous almost. So you have to be very, very careful with these and make sure you're growing the right thing. But in Japan, this is a very, very important vegetable. This is a packing house we visited. There are also ornamental varieties which you can get from nurseries at least in Europe. Flamingo is one of them, which is this pinky. I don't know. I have grown it, but I don't think the flavor is much different. And I should just mention that as we're talking about winter and spring vegetables, we also have a number of traditional spring dishes. After the long winter, often one has developed these multi-species spring dishes. And one of them comes from Japan, and it's called 7 spring flowers. The the Festival of Seven Herbs, it's called, or Nanakusa no Seku or something. It's the Japanese custom of eating 7 herb rice porridge on January the 7th every year. And this is a kind of like a national celebration. So the, whoops, let's go back. The basic 7 herbs, which are noted in this table. I don't know if you can see the names here, but on the right-hand side, you can see some of these. First of all, seri, the last one I showed you. This was actually from a farm which was producing this seri plant. Seri is often included in this, this dish. There's also shepherd's purse, capsella, if you know this. This is the young leaves of this plant. Cudweed, Gnaphallium. I'd never come across this one this genus being used before, but this is included. This is a wild plant in Japan. And Lapsanastrum, which is very closely related to Lapsana communis, which is a wild plant in Europe. Anyway, nipplewort. And I was very surprised to see a whole area with chickweed, Stellaria media, which most of us who are gardeners will have in our gardens already as a weed. So this was a very important edible in this 7 herb spring dish. Also included were just turnip and radish. Okay, and yeah, and when I thought about this 7 spring flowers, there's actually a Danish 7 species dish in the springtime, multi-species dish. It's called Skärtorsdagssupen or Maundy Thursday soup for greens. And you can read this here is taken from my book. You can read it in my book if you've got it. And it basically also contains kale, cabbage, and a number of wild foraged plants such as caraway, sorrel, dandelion, nettles, and ground elder. Oh, something's happened here. Okay, some other plants that I force indoors. I love alliums. I have something like 400 different onions in my garden, and we've actually just recently planted the whole collection plus some others at the botanical garden in Trondheim. So there'll be on display there from this summer, hopefully. But these are some which I basically pot up in the autumn, and these are alliums, wild alliums from Siberia. Allium senescens. Well, this one is from Siberia. This is the North American Allium cernum, or nodding onion, which is one of my absolute favorites. It's actually on the windowsill behind me here. I had some for dinner tonight, so I just just clip the shoots off and use them in stir-fry dishes, that kind of thing, and salads, mixed salads, and then it will resprout again. So as long as there's enough nutrients in the soil, it will continue to resprout. So there are many alliums that you can do this with. Let's see. This is Allium cernum, which was the one on the windowsill, which I ate tonight. Beautiful multi-purpose onion, both beautiful to look at, very tolerant to practically everything you can throw at it. It's both cold tolerant. It could take minus 30 centigrade. It has beautiful edible flowers, and it also grows very quickly. So I could almost see this this is the shoots in the springtime, being sold on supermarkets in the future. Ferns, I mentioned ostrich fern a bit earlier. This is another one which I usually take in a few roots for an early crop of these fiddleheads in the springtime. This is the only species that one should really, there are others which are used around the world. The only one I'd recommend at the moment for human consumption, the only one that's safe to eat. It's a very common plant in the forests in Norway, particularly along rivers. In North America, it was, well, it's very, very popular. It's maybe half a ton, or 500 tons of these, which are harvested from the forests every spring. And because there's a danger of over-harvesting, there's even now an ostrich fern farm in the Great Lakes area of North America. But make sure that it is this species if you're harvesting it from the wild. It's often also grown as an ornamental plant in woodland gardens, so it's a perfect plant for your forest garden. And in Japan, yeah, you can see them in all the supermarkets in the springtime. So this is a very important part of spring in Japan, the young fern sprouts. And they're delicious, so practically everybody that tries them enjoys the taste. This is a sorrel, which I dug up in the autumn and forced inside. So sour leaf, Rumex acetosa, which most of you are familiar with, particularly the people from Moscow and Russia who are listening in. Quite an important vegetable in that part of the world, and also in France, grown on quite a large scale. There are many different varieties, both in France and in Russia. Just a few pictures of a few, if you're going to grow sorrel in your garden, it's probably worth getting hold. Pardon?
Yeah,
it's probably worth.
We eat
this
plant a lot. Traditionally, we eat this plant a lot and make a soup of it. My mother do always.
Excellent. Can you buy it on the market?
Usually not.
No, only personal gardens. Usually, people have some grown, but not in the markets usually.
Okay.
Maybe
okay. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen in Eastern Europe where they actually sell it on markets as well, and in France also. Yeah. Okay, but if you're growing this one in your garden, it could be worth getting one of these non-flowering varieties. These are varieties, there are at least two different varieties. One is called Profusion and the other is Abundance. They are definitely different, and they actually never flower. So they use all their energy in producing leaves. It's just a kind of a misfit or a genetic problem with the plant, that it doesn't actually produce seed. But it's good for us because this plant produces leaves all the summer. So try and get a hold of one of them. But you can't buy seed of it. You have to buy a plant or a cutting. Very easy to divide. This is a French one, Blanc de Lion, which has kind of yellowish leaves in the springtime. And this one I call wine sorrel, which is a red-leaved sorrel, which is actually a subspecies, Vinealis. Vinealis means wine, so we can call it wine sorrel. Looks the same color as red wine. And this is a selection of Russian seeds, which I bought from a seed catalog in Estonia. Maybe you guys from Moscow could tell me what it says. I'm not sure. Chavel, isn't it? But it's the name. Yeah.
The Chavel.
Chavel. Okay, thank you. This is again horseradish in my living room. Again blanched. This here is oca. I don't know if some of you grow the tubers oca. It's one of the Andean vegetables, but I also grow it in the winter and harvest the leaves in the middle of the winter. And the tall plant here is actually Jerusalem artichoke, which I didn't know was in the earth, so it just came up as a weed. But luckily the shoots of Jerusalem artichoke are also edible. So that was a bonus. Okay, I mentioned earlier on that you can also force tree leaves inside, okay? And what I mean by that is that you can actually, if you've got trees around your house in the neighborhood with leaves which are edible, then you can just cut off the twigs and branches, bring them inside, and put them in water on the windowsill. In fact, people do this anyway as a kind of a decoration and kind of a celebration that spring's on its way, particularly around Easter time. And when you bring it inside, the leaves will open. You probably can't see behind me, but in the corner here, there's lime Tilia cordata leaves, which are sprouting. And you can use those. They're delicious, particularly lime, birch, and other ones. You can use a rowan, which has a taste like almonds. The young leaves of, and some people actually use the young leaves of almonds as in cakes and things like that, and that really does give an almond-like taste. Similarly, the leaves of beech can also be brought inside, and hawthorn is also, Crataegus is also popular to some people. So there are many different trees which have edible leaves. Not all, of course. Some are poisonous, so make sure you can find lists on the internet of edible ones. Okay. Seed sprouts. Now I've got a few annuals in here as well because, well, some of these are, to me, almost like perennials. This has actually become a, well, I don't like to say weed, but it actually self-sows every year in my annual vegetable beds. It's a wild buckwheat, Phagopyrum tataricum. So I harvest these seeds myself every autumn. I basically thin out the individual plants which come up in my garden from the grain which spills, and it germinates in different parts of the garden. I just let them grow in between the other, the main harvest, and harvest them in the autumn, dry them off, and then in the winter I will sow them in earth in buckets. And then they will germinate en masse, as you can see here, and you just use some scissors or something to clip them off and use them in winter salads. They're delicious and very nutritious as well. That's one I do it with. You know, these are the. You can also use ordinary buckwheat, but I think wild buckwheat is somewhat better. The seeds are smaller and produced in larger quantities, I think. Wild buckwheat is reckoned to be the wild ancestor of modern buckwheat that we use for making soba and other types of buckwheat pasta, etc. And also the grain, of course. But is actually still grown. Wild buckwheat is also grown in the Himalaya area, particularly in Nepal, because it's actually more cold tolerant than ordinary buckwheat. So if you're living in a cold climate, this is better than ordinary buckwheat. This is the plant in flower, which is rather beautiful also. You can use the flowers as well if you like in salads in the summer. You can sprout peas, for example, and broad beans, fava beans in the winter. Similarly, I just use earth in a bucket. And again, this is cress, which is one of the common ones, which are often, you can buy these kind of sprouting containers, often in plastic. I don't like plastic, so I just use earth, although the bucket itself is made of plastic, unfortunately. Different to get clay ones these days. So I save my own seed again. So it's just grown in the garden in a small area, and you can produce a lot of cress seed quite easily. And then I've been experimenting also with seeds of perennial plants. There's a couple of examples here of ones you can do. This is, let's see, on the left-hand side is Sweet Sicily, Miris, and on the right-hand side is Lovage. The names are here. And here you can see them sprouted at different stages. And you can both use them young or a bit older if you like, or you could just thin them out and let the plants grow on. But the clue is here that perennials, as I've mentioned earlier, often need to be cold treated. They need cold weather in order to germinate. So what I do is I sow the seeds. I collect the seeds from plants in my garden. I sow them in the autumn in soil in a bucket. The bucket just stays outside in the garden for up to 3 months. And then maybe in February, I'll bring the bucket into one of the colder rooms in the house, about 10 degrees centigrade. And within a week or two, the seeds should start to germinate. And then you can start harvesting these tasty young shoots of these two plants. Okay. There are many more. I'm still kind of experimenting with this. There are many more possibilities, but this is just a few. Otherwise, I mean, basically, I would particularly the seed of these two plants, I would harvest anyway, because to stop them sowing themselves and becoming a bit of a nuisance. Sweet Sicily, for example, is a blacklisted plant in Norway, which is or an invasive or noxious weed. So, but it's found in old gardens in many parts. So you harvest the seeds and it stops them spreading as well. So it's an advantage. And you can use them in both in mixed salads and a whole range of different dishes. I don't use recipes. I basically have different types of food that I make, but I never actually plan what things I'm going to have. I just go around my garden or go into my cellar and just pick what is in season, basically. Another thing you can germinate is garlic bulbils. These are the very small onions which are produced on the top of hardneck garlics. Now, most of the commercial garlics that we buy from the supermarket are soft necks. So if you plant them, they don't actually produce, they don't actually flower, because the flower stem would actually get in the way of mechanical harvest. So you can harvest, if you get hold of some of these hardneck varieties, which are also better adapted to cold climates. And there are many different varieties with different sizes of bulbils, as you can see at the top here. The one I prefer is one with medium-sized bulbils. It's an old Scandinavian variety called Alexandra, which comes from Finland, actually. And again, you just, I actually plant these in my kitchen. It doesn't need to be cold treated. They will just germinate in a couple of weeks in ordinary soil. So I just have a bench in the kitchen, which is kept at about 15-20 centigrade in winter. And the young shoots will germinate, and you can just harvest them as I've done at the bottom here. Just clip them off with some scissors. And that will stimulate them to resprout, and you can actually harvest these shoots 2 to 3 times during the winter before the bulbs run out of energy, basically. You could actually grow these outside as well, but it would take, in my climate, 2 to 3 years before they will be as big as an ordinary garlic. Okay, but they are genetically identical to the underground garlic that you've started with. Okay.
Stephen?
Any questions on that part? Yeah.
Yes, Emilia here. First, it's soon 20 minutes to 8. And second, second is that, there is a question about Udo, if we back a bit.
Yep.
Is it so that you first plant it in the cellar and then put it outside in the spring? A person wondered.
It's, well, basically it's a plant which is outside all year, okay? So my oldest Udo I planted from seed in about the year 2000, so it's 17 years old. So that one with me, you know, towering above me, that plant there is about 17 years old, and it comes back every year. You don't need to bring it inside. It's totally hardy. I know people that grow it in Finland also, but what I showed was that you can actually just take, it forms a big clump, and you could just take a bit of root from the side of the plant and move that into the cellar in the autumn while you can still dig the soil. And then you can force it inside for an earlier harvest. Okay?
Thank you. The second is a question from me. Where do I get hold of all these plants? For example, the different onions, the nodding onion, or seeds of,
Well, there are nurseries springing up, both in, well, at least I know in Scandinavia. There are various nurseries. I noticed that Aaron Parker, he's here, I believe, from East Coast US. He has his own nursery over there, very good one. He sells, for example, Hablitzia, I believe. In Scandinavia, we have, for example, Naturplanteskolen, just outside of Copenhagen, which has a very good range. And there's also another one, Tycho and Carolina, also in Denmark. In Norway, there are various Permaculture Plante and a few others. So these nurseries are beginning to spring up because there is beginning to be a real demand for them. In Norway, well, and actually anybody can join the Norwegian Seed Saver organization. Norwegian Seed Savers, you can look up on the net and find us. We produce a seed catalogue every year in February. This year there were 600 different vegetables available, and probably about 100 of those were perennials, many from my own collection. So I like to spread my seeds, if you like, through as far as I can. I'm not in this in a commercial way, but offer many of the perennial vegetables I've been talking about through the Norwegian Seed Saver organization. Okay?
yes, thank you. We have a couple of more questions, but yes, let's take one now. There is a question if you use extra light to the plants that you bring inside and that you grow in room temperature.
No, the salad I made a year ago with 140 varieties. I used no additional electricity or heat of any form. I don't have a greenhouse. I used to have a greenhouse, but it was destroyed in a storm. I decided not to rebuild it and just grow things which I can grow without artificial help, if you like, which is, well, and so I just use the natural heat and light that I have in the house. And yeah, it works pretty well, actually. Okay.
Yeah. So also last question. Do you think that perennials that you grow and that you talk about would give less produce in a warmer climate?
Yes, it certainly could. We know that, for example, the Caucasian spinach, Hablitzia, people struggle to grow it in warm climates. It doesn't seem to like it to be too dry or perhaps too humid and too much sunshine. So we certainly have some advantages. What I'm talking about is from my own personal experience from a cold climate. Certainly not all the plants I can grow, you can grow. I have some advantages because it's a cool climate, but and there are many others that people growing in warmer climates could grow that I can't grow. But there's a huge range out there, so I'd encourage you to do a bit of homework and look at where these plants are growing in the wild. This is what I did basically, and it's basically trial and error. I mean, I've planted over 6,000 different edible plants in my garden over the years, and many of them haven't survived. It's just the way things go. So you have to try in your own climate and follow. Luckily, we've got these social media nowadays where we have things like webinars where we can share our experiences. So the word can get around much quicker, and we can adapt to climate change much quicker in that way.
Thank you. I know also that you are ready to stay a bit longer if needed.
Well, I'm not going anywhere. I'm here to midnight if you want me.
Yeah. So you can also like keep your questions to a bit later if you have time to stay. So, okay, let's continue.
Okay, outside harvest. Now, as I've explained, and well, today it's -15 centigrade, and we have maybe 20-30 centimeters of snow outside. But despite that, I could harvest a couple of leafy green vegetables. One of them is Hablitzia, which is growing up against my house wall. I'd have to dig under the snow, but I know that the young shoots are just waiting there. And similarly, some of the onions, like the nodding onion I talked about. I know where that's growing under the snow. I can dig down and actually harvest some of those greens directly from the garden. This was a very important, by the way, survival food in winter when the Europeans in North America were moving westwards. They learned from the Indians, the Native Americans, that that they could harvest that plant even in the winter time. So that was a very important source of food. And these are pictures taken from a year ago of one of the nodding onions where the snow was just melting around it. So they stay green all winter. One of the few plants that will stay green all winter and survive in my climate. And this is the Hablitzia at the beginning of March last year. Another plant which in milder winters here will actually, this is actually an annual garlic mustard, Aliaria. It's a big invasive weed in North America, but it's a delicious spring vegetable, which in some years germinates in a big way actually in the autumn, and it will stand green throughout the winter and will then grow, seed itself, and eventually die. So it's a winter annual, if you like. But even in my climate, in many years, it will survive the winter in this state. So that's a very good one. Oh, so this one's got a bit out of place, but I was talking earlier about spring ritualistic dishes with multi-species. Another one of these spring dishes comes from North England, and the most important plant in that dish is called bistort, Bistorta officinalis, which is a wild species which grows all the way from the UK to Japan. That's an enormous geographic range. And it's also a plant which was in the past grown as an ornamental in gardens because of these flowers. But it's a wee bit invasive. It tends to spread quite badly. But if you eat it, then you solve that problem. It's the very young shoots which are used in the springtime, and it's part of a North England tradition to make what's called Easter ledge or dock pudding. This is basically a vegetable, let's see, what would we call it? A vegetable patty, we would say in English, which is basically put together using whole barley, which is cooked, together with various different vegetables, often 7 or 8 different wild, like dandelion. This is blanched dandelion here from my garden. This is sorrel, nettles. This is these bistort shoots in the springtime. This is lady's mantle, alchemilla. There's wild onion here, Allium oleraceum, and even things like rhubarb stems. because rhubarb was basically a vegetable in the past. It's only since sugar has become available a couple of hundred years ago that we started to treat rhubarb as a fruit, and a fruit which actually fills the hungry gap in the springtime. That's why rhubarb was introduced originally. It produces in the springtime the young shoots, and at a time of year when there was little other fruit available. It was not available from the store anymore. So basically these were basically cooked up, and traditionally in Northern England these vegetable patties were served with bacon and eggs, and this is really an old tradition which goes a long way back. And this was one of these examples of slow food, which has made a comeback. In 1973, actually, there was a group of local people who saw that this traditional dish was disappearing. Youngsters weren't so interested anymore. So they decided to organize the World Dock Pudding Championship. And really, it was only them and a few other villages that knew about this. And they even advertised this in the Times of London. But yeah, this is a very much springtime multi-species dish based around perennials. And there are also springtime multi-species dishes from the Mediterranean countries, and that was a big inspiration for these multi-species salads, which gave me the name Extreme Salad Man back in 2003, when I made a salad with 537 different ingredients. I found that I was reading about traditional Mediterranean. You remember that you've heard about the Mediterranean diet. They've discovered that old people living in the mountain villages in the Mediterranean countries had very low levels of cardiovascular disease, heart and so on. And ethnobotanists got money to find out what the hell these people had been eating to make them so healthy. And what they discovered was that at least over the last 30 years, that there's a huge diversity of food plants which have been used in the Mediterranean. Actually, over 3,000 different plant species just in the Mediterranean. About 1/3 of all the plants existing have been used for food. And not only that, they also found that they were making these springtime multi-species dishes. So both salads, and typically up to 50, 60 different botanical species in one dish. So there were salads, there were like pizzas, calzone, there were soups, there were pasta dishes, you name it. There were all these different multi-species dishes. And that really gave me the idea for making these diversity salads. So all of these salads you can see here have over 100 different ingredients. And I have my own diet. 80 a day keeps the doctor away, okay? I've also made a pesto with 230 types of onion, because I can. And I've also made a ferment with 412 different plants. Crazy, but why not when you can? And I mentioned a calzone. This was actually a recipe from Sicily in the Mediterranean, which I found on the net, where there were actually 51 different ingredients. This calzone took me 6 years to make, because first I had to grow all of these 51 different vegetables to be available at the same time in the springtime. Only took an hour or so to make, but it was a lot of fun. Okay. Now, last week I was in southern England, and I just show you a few pictures of foraged vegetables in the springtime, as the case was just last week in southern England, because spring has come a long way already. So it's difficult to conceive from where I'm sitting now what it was like just a week ago in southern England. But you could already harvest nettles, ramsons, ramslurk, alexandras is a very common plant in the carrot family growing along the coasts. Dandelion was already in flower. Salad burnet, Sanguisorba minor, is this plant here, which is also used in salads. There were various primroses and primula in flower. I found sorrel, which didn't look like it had frozen at all, but now, just this week, now it's -5 centigrade there, so it's questionable. A lot of these plants will get frost damage now. Sow thistle is an excellent edible genus, which I have about, I think it's about 15 pages in my book about this particular plant. Oxalis species. I even found a fuchsia in flower, and the fuchsia flowers and berries are also edible. Not strictly foraging, as it was hanging out of somebody's garden, but there we go. And this, one of the first alliums to flower is Allium triquetrum from the Mediterranean country, which is a bit of an invasive species in southern England. I mentioned dried and fresh fruit, which is another possibility. Just quickly about that, I dry all my fruit from the garden above a wood burning stove. I make these racks, and there's a wood burning stove producing heat below it. You can see the wood burning stove here, just an old, and I dry both plums and various other fruits on this. But I do store some things like apple in the cellar, and actually I only eat apple as fruit because I've got so much of it from September to, well, not September, about October, November until about now, February, when they start running out. When the apples run out, I go over to dried fruit. And then at this time, at this time of year, I really, for me, spring is fruit diversity time. It's when I have the biggest variation in fruit in my diet, because I dry something like, I think there's about 15 different types of fruit in this list here. And I mix them all together after they've been dried and they're in a storage room, kept cold until the springtime. And then I add water, and then I can use them, for example, on muesli and things like that, breakfast cereal in the, until the fresh fruit becomes available again in July. Usually the first fruit are haskaps and strawberries here, beginning of July. So that's something about fruit diversity. A few tubers, just quickly, as we're running out of time. These are various tubers that I grow in the garden and harvest inside. Many of them do not produce a huge amount, but they are perennials. This is the tuberous pea, Lathyrus tuberosus. Scorzonera is one of my favorite perennial vegetables. My oldest plants are almost 30, 40 years old, but I don't harvest the roots, which is the main crop to most people. I harvest everything else. I harvest the young shoots in the springtime, the leaves, which are sometimes called Scorzonera lettuce. Very good basis for a mixed salad. You can use the flower shoots, the flower buds. The flower shoots are actually very sweet tasting, very surprising. And the flowers are also edible. So this is really a multi-purpose perennial, which can probably can live longer than most of us. And there are a number of other similar plants in the same family, Scorzonera, Tragopogon. This is salsify, an old type of vegetable. This is a biennial, but this one here is a perennial. Scorzonera purpurea is another wonderful one. Tiger nuts, some of you maybe have tried to grow. This is basically a grass with edible tubers, which are delicious, sweet, slightly, yeah, sweet tasting tubers. Can store them. I noticed both in North America and in Japan, they were selling them commercially. So somewhere producing tiger nuts on a commercial scale.
How do you grow them?
I grow them, well, I actually grow mine indoors because in a warmer climate, you can just grow them in garden soil. Just space them In fact, the same species, there are invasive forms of tiger nut. So you've got to be careful in some parts of the world. But it's certainly not going to be, it won't survive the winter outside here in cold climate. So you just basically start them in the springtime, plant them out, and harvest in the autumn. It's quite simple. Dahlias is another family that surprises some people, are edible. We know them mostly as ornamentals, but dahlias came to Europe originally as an edible plant that was outcompeted by the potato, for example. Nowadays, there are a number of permaculture interested people who are trying to breed better tasting varieties of dahlias, but all dahlias can be used. Both the tubers and the flowers are also edible. Yakon.
Stephen?
Yep.
I just want to acknowledge that maybe some people need to go now,
Okay.
but that we will continue. I just want to say that hopefully, if everything goes as it's planned, there will be a recording from this talk that will be put in the event of this webinar, and probably also put up on YouTube later. So if you need to go, you can see the last part later. And I just want to say thank you for participating. Okay, but
Yeah,
let's continue.
Yeah, thank you from me as well. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Just a technical thing. If you want to leave, just push the end meeting button in the right corner, down in the right corner, and you will then put like push leave meeting. So, okay, thanks.
Yeah, there's Yakon. I'll go quickly through these as we're running out of time, but Yakon is a plant which some people are now growing, can be stored and used in the winter. Here's a diversity of colourful tubers, which I grew at home and we had for a Christmas dinner one year. These are all plants from South America, from plants from the Andes, both potato, the blue potato, blue Congo, Oca, Uloko, and Mashua. Another one, another favourite, at least taste-wise, is Tigridia, which you can sometimes buy as autumn bulbs, as ornamentals. But actually the cooked bulbs of Tigridia are delicious tasting. And it has a beautiful flower as well. Not edible as far as I know. One Christmas I made something which I called Tubasmagoria, which was for Christmas dinner. We served 25 different edible tubers of 16 species. So there's a huge variety of tubers which could be grown and stored and used inside. And one of them is actually behind me here. Some of you commented on that there are some trees behind me, or somebody wrote a message a bit earlier. What we can see behind me is a coffee tree, and there's also two trees of the genus Brachychiton, which you can see at the bottom here. These are both trees from Australia. They're not hardy, so they form part of my indoors forest garden, my indoor edible garden in the corner here. And one of them is this one here, which is actually cultivated in Australia for its edible tubers. You can see them here. Whoops, these edible tubers. I didn't get a huge yield, but it's often grown from seed, and then actually, although it's a tree which could be 100 years or more old, it's harvested for the tubers after just one season. In my house, it grows somewhat slower because it's cooler, but I do manage to harvest tubers now and again. I don't harvest everything. I just take off a few side roots and then replant, as you can see here. So this plant now is about 15 years old, and I've harvested it maybe twice. So I'm kind of nice to it. The other one, this tall one here, is Brachychiton, is actually this plant here. It's beautiful. It's commonly planted in tropical countries, and is actually a nut tree in addition. Produces edible nuts. And it's already reached the ceiling in my living room, and so the idea is that we'll drill a hole in the ceiling, and it will be allowed to go up into my bedroom, so that when I'm a really old man, I can harvest nuts from my bed, and it will also make these beautiful flowers. That's the dream, anyway. Houseplant edibles. Now, houseplant edibles is a subject in itself. There are thousands of edible plants you could be growing in your house. I'm a bit limited by space. I know one guy in Seattle in the US is writing a book on houseplant edibles. Hopefully that will come out in the next few years. It will be a major work. And there's also a Norwegian living in England, who is also writing a different book on houseplant edibles. So look out for those. But just a few examples of ones that I do grow. I grow taro, which is a very popular, very common tuber in tropical countries, which is actually rather attractive as well. Has these rather nice roundish leaves, and the leaves are also edible. This guy comes from Nepal, and he and his wife came to. They were living in Trondheim. They came to my house to make a Nepalese feast from the plants I have from Nepal in my house and garden, and this was one of them. Also has a nice flower. I harvest a couple of tubers about once a year. There are a number of herbs you could grow indoors. Cuban oregano is a very easy one to grow that doesn't tend to get green fly and other house pests, and can be harvested all winter and used instead of oregano, for example. I used it in the salad. I also have, well, I don't eat, I gave up eating sugar in about 2000, but once a year, I say that I'm 100% self-sufficient in sugar, because I eat sugar once a year, and it comes from my sugarcane plant, which is in my windowsill here. This is my daughter, who's having a little chew on my sugarcane. I also grow lemongrass. That's easy to grow on the windowsill. You could just buy lemongrass often from the supermarket, and it will set roots. Seeds and nuts, we can also have. So these are all things that went into the salad a year ago to make 140. Top left here, opium poppy. I grow a lot of opium in my garden. Opium is not illegal, but they're beautiful flowers. You can see a big album of the flowers I have on my website, edimentals.com. So the seed I use on bread in the winter, along with a number of other different homegrown plants. Plantago major, or greater plantain is one of them. The seeds are edible, quite similar to flax seed, caraway seed, and also evening primrose seed. A number of different species. You can grow your own bread seed, if you like. Polygonum viviparum, or the is called alpine bistort in English, and grows in the mountains of Norway. And use these what look like seeds, but actually are bulbils, which I dry and also use on bread and baked dishes in the winter. Of course, hazelnuts, for example, you can grow and store them as well. Some flowers. There are various begonias, houseplants, which have edible flowers. Blackcurrant sage is one which salvia, which starts to flower in the autumn and will continue if you bring the plant inside in the autumn. There are many violets and pansies which can be used in winter, and in milder climates will also flower in cold temperature outside. And this is one that I brought inside for the one of the early spring flowering plants in my garden. This is an oxlip, Primula elatior, which I'm actually standing outside here, photographing into the plant in the window of my house. Other spring flowering plants that I enjoy, ramsons is a very good one. You can use the flowers of all of these in salads. You can see in the salad the white flowers in the top right is this one. This one here is a favourite onion that I grow, very hardy. Actually comes from the mountains of Syria and Lebanon. It's called Allium zebdenense, and it has these beautiful white flowers in springtime. And it's actually in all these salads here, but I included these because you can also see the yellow flowers of dandelion. This is a cardamina. Tulips are early. You can also force tulips indoors. You can use the petals of tulips. They're delicious tasting. Not any other part, as it's poisonous. Yeah, and these are other types of primula or primrose. And this one here, Primula denticulata, is also edible and beautiful in spring salads. You can see them here too. Allium paradoxum is another beautiful white flowering spring allium. And this one here from China, Allium doesn't have English name, Allium humili, from China and India at 4,000 meter. It grows very well in my garden and produces these beautiful white flowers in springtime. I have one edible houseweed, which is a very bad picture, but this is chickweed, Stellaria media, which often comes up in my pot plants and plants that I'm forcing indoors. Forcing pots, we've talked a bit about that. Forcing pots were traditionally used outdoors to bring on perennials outside, mainly rhubarb, sea kale and asparagus in the UK. But you can force many other different plants, including, for example, this one here, which is hosta, which is one of the world's most common ornamental plants. This is actually bought in a Japanese supermarket. All the supermarkets have hosta shoots in the springtime. You'll recognize them from these big shoots. Much more in my book about that. We have to get on. Japanese supermarket full of hosta, which most people who grow ornamentals in both Europe and North America have. I think we're
Stephen?
Yeah, I think we're just going to finish now. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, maybe it's just a little bit left. I was thinking if there were some questions.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly go through these last ones and then we're finished. So I wasn't really going to show these because they're not perennials, but if you've got a greenhouse, obviously you can bring on things quickly. Various things, traditional vegetables in the cellar, Jerusalem artichoke, burdock, potatoes, of course. You could have many different potatoes in a salad if you wanted. Lilies are edible, lily bulbs. And various, this is my cellar. This is what it looks like. So I have these boxes full of traditional annual vegetables like Swiss chard and leeks. And chicories, I also love. Chicories, some chicories are perennial as well. Parsley, and just a few pictures showing how we made the salad. The salad dressing included various things like Cuban oregano, sweet Aztec herb, lemongrass, bay leaf, sugarcane, and staghorn sumac, Rhus typhina berries. Just putting together the ingredients and yeah, the final salad. And the day after, we made one even bigger. And that's it, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Wow. And just we give space for some questions.
Yeah, sure.
We do have a couple from Kirst. One is if you have any recommendation of a good apple variety for a colder climate, and the other is any recommendations for growing sweet potato, particularly the purple Japanese variety? Recommendations for that?
Yeah, two difficult questions really, because as far as apples are concerned, they're often old varieties, locally, which are particularly adapted to your climate. But so it's difficult to generally answer that. In my climate, the most productive and easy to grow variety is called Aroma. Every year it produces masses of apples. And in fact, my area is much easier to grow fruit than even in England, because we never get late frost, because by the time the fruit trees are flowering, we don't have nighttime anymore. It's light all the time, so the nighttime temperature doesn't decrease. But I know that in very cold climates, I saw recently, I think it was a YouTube video from northern Sweden, where they were, there was some new technique, maybe you've seen that, Emilia, where they were growing apples in an area which was traditionally not recognized as being a good area to grow apples. I can't remember the details.
No, not me either. I don't know.
What was the other question?
Recommendations for growing sweet potato, especially.
So I can't help you with, because I don't really have that much experience with. It's not something that will grow easily in my climate. It's basically too cold in summer. I've tried growing it indoors, but I recommend you looking at some of the books, some of the stuff the Canadians have been doing. Elliot Coleman has a lot about cold hardy sweet potato. There's also a woman called Telsing Andrews at Astor Lane Edibles in near Ottawa, who's been testing and trying to grow actually from true seeds, which is possible. Also Cultivariable, and William Whitson in the US is doing a lot of good work there too. Yeah.
Thanks. And then I got some more questions here. What about crop rotation in perennial systems?
Well, I believe in polyculture is what I do in probably the most extreme way, in that I don't have many of each plant. So in my case, actually, I see very little disease anyway. So there's no real reason for me to do that. And I think if you create, grow as many things as you can within reason. Obviously, you don't need to grow 2,000, but if you grow a good selection of perennials, that they will all work together, I think, with the fungi and the trees and in this kind of system. It's difficult to give advice. You just have to try.
And here another question. You mentioned a couple of Facebook groups. Except that, are there any other groups or forums that you can recommend?
Well, we have our own forum, Norwegian Seed Savers. We call ourselves Kvan, which means Angelica in Norwegian. I have my own forum, Edimentals, EDIMENTALS, where I publish most of my stuff in addition to my own homepage and my own blog, edimentals.com. We have, I mentioned earlier, plant breeding for permaculture. We have, what else have we got? We've got a special forum for dandelions, Taraxacum, you can find just by searching. One for Hablitzia, if you're interested in growing that plant. And there are various permaculture, other just general permaculture type fora, which are worth joining. I can't hear you.
Yeah, we got a recommendation about sweet potato from Marcus, and there's a person in southern Sweden that grows quite a lot of varieties.
Okay.
And you can find the website there in the chat. We can also share that later.
Okay, good. Yeah.
So, and people start to say thank you very much for this presentation, and that it was really great.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you all very much as well for taking part. And it worked technically, I think, pretty well.
Yeah, it's a good tryout, definitely. And I think we can continue at other points in time. So I wonder now, is there any other question that someone would like to ask before we stop?
I want to ask about the nutritional properties of the plants. I don't know if there's as much information available as vegetables you would find more commonly in the supermarket, but I was wondering if you know what kind of properties the plants have.
Yeah, well, I think that, can you hear me? Or yeah, I think that generally, I think nutritional problems come from eating too much of the same thing, rather than, so if you eat a diversity of plants and vegetables generally, I think you kind of decrease the danger of getting any what you call it, lack any minerals or things like that. And generally, most of the perennials that I'm growing are not actually that much selected from the wild plants. And we know that many of the wild edibles that you could forage have higher nutritional content than the typical supermarket plants, which have been selected for totally different things than nutrition. So they've been selected for yield and sweetness and profit. So there are a number of analyses on wild edible plants, which all point towards wild edibles being more nutritious than, and so you can and as many of these perennials are very close to the wild plants which we've evolved with, then I think I think generally there's nothing to worry about as far as that's concerned. And in my case, because I'm also using seaweed as my main, and I have a very mineral-rich soil, and seaweed is very full of all the minerals you need, and that's a very good one to use if you've got access to it, if you do need to fertilize. Okay. I can't hear you.
Thank you. We got tips that here in Sweden there's a good source for perennial seeds. It's the organization SESAM that is a seed organization here.
Yeah, a Swedish seed saver. It's the equivalent of the Norwegian seed savers. So yeah, it's very good group. Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so I suggest that we finish here. And once again, lots of thank you to you, Stephen, that you had the courage to try this out. And let's take it further and see where it goes. And thank you to all of you that have been participating, and hoping that we can meet in real also somewhere, and perhaps again in this forum. So I would also like to say thank you from the Permaculture Sweden and the project partnership PolyCulture. So, okay. So we end the meeting here.
Okay, bye-bye.
Maybe- Yeah, everyone could just turn on their microphones and say goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, there's people.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
And
Thank
bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
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 Yeah, cheers.
Cheers.
Всем спасибо, мы отключаемся, а вы можете оставаться, если хотите, и пишите, пожалуйста, в комментариях. Пока. Да, и спасибо Майе, потому что я без Майи не знаю, как справился сегодня. Надо ли, если надо сохранить вот эти записи с названиями растений, их можно скопировать и куда-то в блокнот хотя бы вставить, а то пропадут. Хорошо. Вот, да. Ну и все, пока-пока.
Okay. Now I end.